I've always loved this idea that our lives are stories. And a question I often ask myself is, what is the story I want my life to tell? The way we choose to live shapes a story, and the stories we choose to tell can shape our lives. Today, I introduce you to Hillary Rea. I met Hillary just about a year ago when I reached out for her support in finding my voice and learning to tell my own stories. Our work together had a true impact in my confidence and ability to share more of myself. And I made a friend. Get ready to take a journey into your own voice and your own stories and where they might be waiting to take you.
I'm Carla Reeves, and this is Differently, a podcast where we explore the ins and outs of what becomes possible when we're willing to think, do, and show up differently to the moments of our everyday lives. Hey, Hillary, welcome to Differently. I am so excited that you're here and we get to dive into some conversation.
Yes, Carla, I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so I don't know if you know this, but when I think of Differently, you were one of the first people that came to mind as wanting to bring you on the show because you carry yourself differently in the world. And I noticed right from the get-go when we first engaged and then when we got engaged, that sounds funny. But when I first reached out to you to connect about your work in the world, and you are somebody who every time I get an email from you or a Voxer or any sort of engagement, there is something different about it. It just feels like you were present in the moment when you did it. And it's very thoughtful. It's very intentional. It's like I get the feeling that you had all the time in the world to send that one little message to me. And I love that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit, give us a sense of your work in the world today and kind of who you are in the world.
Sure. So I guess to say what seems to be a cliche, especially in the film and television world, I am a storyteller. But I really am a storyteller. My work, my business revolves around helping people tell stories from their life to illuminate a bigger idea, a message, a call to action. And I tell stories from my own life, which started out as being on stage in front of people, and now currently making what I'm calling an audio memoir as part of a podcast that I've put out for a couple of years now. But yeah, I just really believe that if we stop and listen to each other tell stories, and we're equipped with the internal power and ownership to share who we are in an intentional way, we can understand each other better. And ultimately, this is big, but the world can be a better place.
I love that. So take us back. Where did this begin for you?
Yeah, I used to say it began for me in 2009 when I was sort of easing my way back into performance after taking some time off and knew I made people laugh in my everyday life and knew I've always been funny and I own that. But I wanted to try comedy. And so that's to me where I had that light bulb moment of, oh, I'm telling stories from my life. They're funny. People are laughing. I feel this connection. I want to do it more. But it's funny, in the past year and in having so much time to really go inward because of the pandemic and spending a lot of time at home and sort of rekindling my creative flame and fire, I can now see that I really did start telling stories about my life when I was a really little kid. And I did a lot of writing as school assignments, but I think I always twisted every school assignment around to make it about my story and my life, even if that wasn't exactly the assignment. So I'm starting to own that as the origin of my work and like going all the way back to like a very early age.
I love that. So why, for people listening who I know you work with, what do you call it? Like multi-passionate entrepreneurs and impact-driven leaders. But this also applies to everyday life, like you're talking about. And so speak to the range in which, people can be listening from when we talk about storytelling.
Yeah. So I just spent a lot of time talking about me telling my own stories in an artistic sense, but really in the last 5 years or so, I've cultivated a whole business around using personal narrative stories in everyday communication, whether that is formally in the business world or in the entrepreneurial world, but honestly, just in the way that we're connecting with humans on the day to day. Like if you're meeting someone for the first time over Zoom or a cup of coffee or at a networking event, or even sitting with family members that maybe there's been a communication challenge coming in the way of true connection and trust. I really believe that digging into the stories we want to tell about ourselves to other people is a tool that does apply across communication platforms. So whether that is a more official platform or just that everyday interaction, when we crave connection, we crave understanding, we crave showing up, or I guess I can't say we, but I and the people I work with and people I'm in conversation with crave showing up differently. But differently to me is showing up more true to who we are and being okay with that.
I love that. So I know when you and I started working together that I had a narrative inside my head that I wasn't a storyteller and I can't tell stories and it's hard to tell stories and I'm not good at telling stories and on, right? So how do you said something, when we can have that internal power and ownership of our stories, how do you help people like myself get over that? Because you really did help me get over that. And I find that it's easier to just pull in they might not even be stories like I thought they had to be, but it's like just a little snapshot of a moment to give an example when I'm writing something, or I find that is getting easier and easier. So speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, that's really good to hear and exciting to hear. There's two ideas that are coming to mind based on what you said. The first is that I believe there are only a handful of people in each of our social circles or professional circles who are born storytellers. Like they could just open their mouth and regale you with a tale and take you on a ride and you're totally enraptured and it can happen off the cuff. And the language is perfect. The delivery is perfect. I don't know if you have someone like that in your life.
Oh,
I do.
Totally. It's amazing.
Yeah. But for the majority of people, I don't have data on this, but the majority of people, that is not the case. And that it's something, storytelling is a skill and a muscle that you can build and that it takes work. And I am an example of someone who just spent a really long time building my storytelling muscle and becoming so invested in the craft and the conceptual element of why it's such an impactful and powerful communication tool that I'm able to build my muscle over time. And so now sometimes I can open my mouth and what comes out is good enough, but it's because of a lot of work. So that's maybe good news to people listening, and that you can build the muscle and build the skills and tell stories. And the more you tell them and the more you practice and the more you play, the easier it becomes and the less of like a daunting responsibility it turns out to be. And then the other thing that's coming to mind is what I've been exploring lately is seeing storytelling and identity as really closely connected. And I see that as like a three-pronged connection, which is the stories we tell ourselves, the stories other people tell about us, and then the stories we choose to tell other people. And so I think what you experienced and what people I work with experience is when we go to that third prong, the stories we choose to tell other people, that's where it comes from, this internal, intrinsic motivation and that's where the power emanates from, and the true alignment of like, this is a story I want to tell because it connects to who I am and what I stand for and what I do and the message I want to give out into the world. When we take that ownership and flip the switch of telling our stories from that internal place before it becomes an external place, then our internal narrative becomes more supportive. And same with the stories that other people tell about us become more aligned because we're steering the ship of our story, or we're the main character of our story. And so maybe the negative self-talk stories we tell ourselves, or the uncontrollable narratives of other people, it doesn't really matter. And then they also go away, which is exciting.
I remember when we were working together, and you helped me. I guess when you would have me practice, right? And that was so uncomfortable. That was such an uncomfortable part for me to practice. But when you would have me practice, I would basically be telling you about what happened. And I remember you kept saying to me, like, take me there. Take me there. So speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's, again, storytelling can feel very heady because your brain is activated. You're thinking of a memory of a life experience that you want to articulate in some way. And so when it goes from brain to voice in a non-scientific way, it's still it can be very cerebral because you're bringing yourself back to the memory, but you want to then explain what it is that you're remembering. But the best way to do that, and the most effective way for the person listening and for the storyteller, is to show, not tell. And so I'm a very visual thinker. So for me, like, I can go back to those life experiences in like a motion picture, like a very cinematic way. And so if I can see what's happening, I can then speak to it in a way that just brings folks into the moment. Like, if I'm wanting, like, I know, for example, like, you have a story where you started at this gathering, this dinner party, and really bringing people into the scene of that dinner party. And I remember that because of how you brought me into the scene of the dinner party, not because I like helped you get to that place. Like, I now have that imprinted moment of your story that helps me remember you, remember the rest of the story, remember what I walked away with from that story. So that's another reason too, is shifting from telling to showing just is of service to the storyteller, but also to the listener, because they can walk away with something to hold on to.
Yeah. And so that's important as business owners, right? Because we're making something more memorable, more tangible for people to take away from, right? Because like you're saying, they're going to walk away and take those little snippets of moments into their life. And I remember after I did that talk that you really helped me prepare for, I remember talking to people after it that reached out to me, and they did cling on to a little moment of the story is what really called them to reach out. And so is that what you find in your work with people, that it does make their work more memorable? It makes, like, talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny. Oftentimes there's a resistance to sharing personal narrative stories because I've heard, and I've thought this myself too, I can't say that I've never thought this, but people saying, well, it feels very self-indulgent to tell this I, listen to me, talk about me story. But it's actually, again, in service of the listener, because the more specific your I story is for you and how you share it, the more universal it really becomes for the person listening. And then they can think about all of the I's in context of their me's. And so when that happens, there's a dialogue and there's an exchange, even if the listener isn't speaking. There's still, you're in conversation with whoever you're sharing your story with. And you're also taking up enough space to allow the story to live and breathe and land. And so what's exciting and what I've noticed for myself, my own stories, and when I hear things about like your success with your storytelling and other folks that I work with, is people then respond. And even if it's like hitting reply to a newsletter, like I remember I did this to your newsletter a couple of weeks ago and just saying, I really connected with that story, or I really loved this moment. And sure, that people can feel that without there being like verbal validation. But I like to imagine that if I have two people that out loud respond to something in my story, either by hitting reply to an email or telling me out loud face to face, there's tens to hundreds of more people that are getting that same feeling and having that same response. And they're just not verbally announcing it back to me, because I know I've been moved by stories and also haven't shared with the person, but the story stays with me, or what I took away from the story and the person stays with me. So it really is a powerful tool, and you are in service of other people, even when it's I.
Like what I hear you saying is it's generous, actually, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're letting people into a piece of us that allows them to travel into a piece of themselves. And I mean, how many times as you were talking, I just was imagining like moments of being in a room where someone's telling a story and you're on your own little personal journey as they're telling that story. And it's a beautiful thing. So tell us a little bit about, so I know for myself, like one of having my voice and giving myself voice has been a lifelong journey, right? I remember as a young girl, my mom would tell me that, my report cards were always good, but they would always mark confidence, like a lack of confidence. And that's something on my personal and entrepreneurial journey that I just have to keep stepping into, over and over and over again. And it's felt hard at times. And so what for you in your journey of storytelling and creating a business around this, what have been your struggles, if you're willing to share with us?
Yeah, similar struggles, and literally a struggle of getting my voice back. And I can go into what that means a bit. So my early background and my educational background is actually in vocal performance and singing. And so I've been singing my entire life, officially started training at age 10, dreams of being on Broadway. And then I went to a very competitive musical theater program for college in New York. And looking back on it now as an adult, seeing that probably what I experienced was imposter syndrome, but I didn't know what that was or have context for it. But immediately, I would say within the first week of entering that musical theater program as a freshman, I became so afraid of my voice. And it was because I all of a sudden thought I wasn't good enough to be there. I was hearing voices of all of these other people in my class that were like, I was like, I'll never sing like that. All of this negative talk started happening. And then it honestly got reinforced by educators, by professors, and because that's the way the program was designed, to kind of break you down to build you back up. But I, as an 18 to 22-year-old, was not in an emotional headspace to handle that. And I don't think I really was attuned enough to myself to know what was happening. So through that experience, I literally lost my voice. I had crippling stage fright. Every time I opened my mouth to sing, my voice would crack. I'd be privately with my teachers or in a practice room and everything would be fine. And then getting up in front of people, it was the most terrifying thing. Like it would be like I was having a panic attack. And I made it through that program, but I very soon after was like, I don't think I can sing. I don't want to do this. This is like not a fun experience to go through. So then like flash forward a handful of years later, and I started to use my voice again via telling my own stories. And it was really terrifying at first. But it was like, it would be terrifying. And then I'd get up on stage and I'd feel free. And I hadn't felt free like that. And I hadn't felt like this is who I am. This is how I want to share who I am. I'm using my voice in a different way, but it is my voice and I own it. And that's been a journey. And it didn't happen instantaneously, But I found my confidence again and found my like physical voice again through the willingness to share a piece of who I am in a way that I had power over and believed in and wanted to share with other people. It wasn't, again, like to get applause or get laughter, or when I was doing competitive shows to win. Like, sure, that was maybe part of it, but ultimately, like, tracing my experience, like going through, it really was like about connection to other people, but also connection to myself. So I've seen this with other people, that when you do find the right story to tell and you have the tools to tell it, there is this confidence that, like, again, it starts inside, but you exude confidence when you're sharing a piece of who you are, because it almost doesn't matter what anyone thinks. And then the cool thing is most people are like, oh, I feel very connected to this person. I feel like I understand them. It's making me think about myself in a whole new way. Like, there's such a positive, natural, positive response and engagement with storytelling.
Well, and that's like when you speak your truth, right? When you hear truth or you speak your truth, like there's just natural connection to that. I think you were making me think about how incredibly powerful our thinking is and can have such a huge impact on our voice. And for me, in third grade, we had to get up in front of our class to say what we wanted to be when we grew up. And at that time, I loved animals, and I especially loved monkeys. And I got up in front of my little classroom and told them that I wanted to be a monkey trainer. And you can imagine what happened. Everybody erupted in laughter, right? Like, of course, like as in my adult mind, that totally makes sense. Like, that's funny, right? But I didn't realize this until I was in my early 20s doing some personal work in my own life to get over my confidence issues. But that 20-second blip of time had such a huge impact on my life, because in that moment, I decided that I was dumb and different, and I didn't ever want to speak up because I didn't ever want to feel like that again. And those narratives that we create in our head, like I can see now that wasn't necessarily true, but I made it true. And that really dictated my voice for years and years and years.
Yeah, again, it goes back to that kind of can be problematic combination of stories we tell ourselves and stories other people tell about us. And when we ignore the third prong, it sticks with us in a way that really can impact everything that we do and how we show up. But now, in hearing you share that story, I'm like, I want to hear a whole story about that with, like, obviously your new perspective on it. I think, like, what a beautiful short story to share with people. So thank you for sharing it.
Yeah. Yeah. We might have to do that. So I also remember a moment in working with you that, I think you talk about it as your origin story, like inside of your business, that we have an origin story that we always tell. And I'd been telling a certain one for years and years and years. And I remember you saying, does that story honor who you are now? And I wasn't feeling great about it anymore. And you really gave me permission to, ask myself what story would honor me now. And that was such a fun process. So tell us a little bit about how you work with people, because I'm sure people are curious. What does that look like?
Yeah. So I believe that you don't have to have like a certain formulas of stories or a template to bring a story to life. The hero's journey is the most popular format for storytelling. And even if you haven't heard that term before, it's really the storytelling style in Western culture of everything from Pixar movies to like TED Talks and how people talk about themselves, especially professionally. And I let myself kind of push that aside and explore, like, what are those other ways that we can tell stories? And so I believe in what you said, that an origin story, which is also a term that's used in superhero stories and comic books and things, and also in business. But I believe that it is the story of how you got to where you are now and how you got your superpowers. But you really have to focus on the where are you now, to get the right story that will serve you presently in who you are, what you do, what you stand for. So it's one of those things where it's like spring cleaning. You kind of have to figure out like, oh, this story that I've been telling for a while, it's the one that just naturally comes out, especially when I'm introducing myself. But I don't think it actually represents me or makes me feel good about who I am, or it's not the full story, or it doesn't give a bigger picture. It's probably time to start that, or like start the wheels turning on the possibilities of a different origin story. And so I often work with the clients I work with, we often work on that. And sometimes it's the release of the old story, like learning these new storytelling tools and building that muscle to get the old story out and then say like, see you later, old story, and then dig and try to find the new one. But I think once you have that current origin story, there's all of these extra stories that spur off of it in like a web or connect the dots and give people even a bigger picture of who you are and give yourself a bigger picture of who you are. So I think it's always good to have that origin story and to check in on it, even if if it's not the primary story that you're telling either in your everyday life or in your professional life. Like currently I'm refreshing my origin story via the third season of my narrative storytelling podcast. So it's going to unfold over 10 episodes. And then maybe after that, I'll put together the spoken version, but I'm like playing with it now. And I can still pull from those old origin stories, but know that I'm working towards a new one.
And as part of that origin story, I think I saw something you had written about that moment during the pandemic, right? Where the technology failed. Would you tell that story?
Yeah, so that's definitely part of it. So in March of 2020, it was the week leading up to, at least where I live, like the official shutdown of everything and declaration that there was a pandemic going on. And I obviously knew that something was shifting and changing in the world and things were potentially going to shut down. But I had a completely live in-person business. I had a live storytelling show that I produced. I only worked with Philadelphia clients in person in a group setting. And sort of everything that I was holding on to was like crumbling rocks. And then on top of that, I really also believed at that time that in order to experience the magic of storytelling, both as the storyteller and the listener, you had to be in the same room, because there is that in-person exchange of energy that I'm sure a lot of us are still craving to go back to. But I always talked about that in my work. Like, I believe that this can only be experienced in person. There's no other way to do it. And I was slated to speak at this virtual conference, which I had done a couple virtual things, but it never was comfortable for me. But this one was okay because I knew I could see the face of the person and it was a dialogue and not like a webinar kind of style. But the technology broke. And so I couldn't see the person who was interviewing me. I could only see myself. So she went to the chat and just started writing the questions, but it was me like looking at the pinhole of my camera, which terrified me at the time because I was like, I'm not talking to anybody. But I really doubled down on, oh no, I am talking to someone, and like visualizing who I was speaking to. And I think I used my natural communication style was to just like deflect with humor and undermine the value of my work and what I believed in. And because I knew I could like make people laugh and entertain and know what I'm talking about, but in a very like watered down way. And I couldn't do that because I didn't have that like dialogue or like energy that I could do with somebody else. And so it really felt like a tunnel, like, oh, I have to teach people what I believe in. Okay, I do believe in it. So here I go. I'm just going to be, it like really felt like I was like, it was the most vulnerable I felt. And it wasn't even me sharing like stories from my life. It was like me committing to my work and like showing up for my work. And then really like trusting that I am speaking to someone, even if I can't see them. And that shifted everything for me in like how I found even more power in storytelling. I found power, like, I was like, oh, whoa, like what I do is different, but I believe in it so much. And I want other people to understand or get curious about it in some way. So that's definitely part of the shift. And then there's this shift of like what I shared earlier of like finding this book I wrote when I was 10 that's called Millicent Wimbleberry, The Early Years. But I was Millicent Wimbleberry and I changed all the names of all the people in it, and just like finding that book and seeing stories I wrote when I was 10 that are still stories, parts of stories I've told on stage in my 20s and 30s. So exploring that as well. So that's that's
Wow.
pieces of the origin story that are coming together at the moment as we're recording this.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's such clues to looking back to our childhood for the work we're intended to do. I love that. And it sounds like that experience during the pandemic was the perfect storm to launch you into what you're doing today. And I had a similar experience. I had the same belief that storytelling in the head of, I'm not going to speak virtually. Like, I'm not into that. That's not my thing. You can't connect with people. I had all that same noise in my head. And I too had a live event scheduled for November. It was a keynote, and it was the one you helped me with. And it was supposed to be live in person. And I got the email saying it was going to be virtual, and I almost backed out. Like, I wasn't really interested. And I think I talked to my coach at the time and asked her got her advice around it. And she's like, I think you need to do that. I think there's something in that for you. And I had the same experience as you of like sitting in this office by myself in front of a computer screen, looking at the pinhole and just feeling like, I don't know how this is going to go. And similar to you, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but it was like that, like ultimate fear and then that ultimate freedom following doing that it was really a pivotal moment for me too, where I gave up all that old story and thought this can be impactful. And actually it was the most impactful talk I've ever given by the response I got from people and people wanting to work with me. And so that kind of blew all that noise out of the water, right?
Yeah. And I think it's also sounds in what you just said too, like impactful for you going back to the internal. Like, not only did you get this like amazing external response, but like it's like that when you find that freedom to let go. I always call it like the finding freedom and putting yourself out there instead of like the sort of, fear or uncertainty or discomfort of putting yourself out there. When you experience that switch flipping, it feels so good. And it feels like it's almost like it's exposing, but more safe at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, you were talking about imposter syndrome, and there's a guy that I've followed for years that I really, really respect, Rich Litvin, and he coaches really highly successful people who have done really amazing things, and they all have imposter syndrome. And he says, I don't worry about imposter syndrome. I worry when it goes away. And I think about my own journey of being an entrepreneur, and every single time I've been invited to do something that felt bigger than I could do, there's always like an internal, like screeching, like dig in my heels, like, no, hell no, I don't want to do that. But I always say yes. And I don't really know why, but I do know why. It's that bigger why of like, I'm here to do something and I know that. And I have to say yes. I just know I have to say yes. And every time I do, you sort of figure it out along the way and you experience that fear and then that freedom, right? Have you experienced that on your journey too?
Oh, my whole entire life. I've always ended up putting myself in situations where can I pause for a second? Can you hear my cat? She's meowing. Is it coming through?
No, that's funny, but my dog was just barking too.
Okay, because I can pause and put her away if it's distracting. Okay. So yes, I will answer that thought. Yes, that has happened to me my entire life. I, for some reason, have always had the confidence to seek out opportunities that really do seem bigger than what's possible. Like when I was in high school, I published my own fanzine. There's a movie out on Netflix right now called Moxie, and I related to it very much because she puts out her own fanzine and distributes it around her school. And I did the same. But what I did, and I can't even remember how I did this because this was really at the birth of the internet. I'm aging myself, but I interviewed really big bands, and they let a 16-year-old, they like booked a time, and I interviewed them and published these interviews in this zine that at one point was Xeroxed and then was on newsprint, but only like 1,000 copies, and 500 of which are still in my basement. But just like doing that and like showing up backstage at these venues and interviewing people. And then like early on in comedy and telling my stories on stage in comedic venues, I reached out to like my hero comedian on Twitter and through this long story that I've told many times in keynotes and on stage too, he let me open for him. And it was just me sending a tweet and then also voicing who I was when I saw him in person at a book signing, things like that. And even like a couple of weeks ago, I reached out to be on this podcast that I admire so much. And I ended up being on it, and it was really fantastic. But it's like, I do feel that like, oh no, like, what am I getting myself into? Like, this isn't like, I'm not ready for this every single time. And then it breaks through and goes to the next. And I wouldn't give up my like internal like passion for reaching out to people that feel, or opportunities that feel completely out of reach, because I've seen so many times over and over again that things have come of it.
I love that. So if you're listening and you have something in your life that you're shaking in your boots about, just know that that's totally normal and you can still say yes. And there's something amazing on the other side. I see that all the time in the work I do with people too. So What are you excited about now in your work and what you're doing?
I'm really excited about reigniting my creative self with my entrepreneurial self, which I know probably on the outside it looks like it was always interwoven. But I think when I became so passionate about building a business from my art and like shifting away from telling my story to helping other people and supporting other people telling their stories, and in a different way, like not for entertainment, I was like, well, I don't have to work on my storytelling. I don't need to tell stories. Like, I'm just going to focus on everybody. But then I felt like I wasn't actually like practicing what I teach, or I was telling, not showing. And so, I've just like in the last year, I've like partially I'm doing The Artist's Way, which, are you familiar with that book?
Yeah. That was like the origin of my entrepreneurial journey. Yes.
Yeah. And I know like a lot of the work you do with people, like with writing and journaling, when I was starting to do The Artist's Way, I was thinking about you in that regard too. So doing that, and then really trusting that I do still have stories to tell, and that you do have to, I always say, like, you have to live your life and then figure out like what from your life is a story. You shouldn't be living your life to get the stories. It doesn't really work that way. And then if your life is just helping people tell stories, there's not going to be much of a story to tell beyond that. So I really, I'm excited about like merging the two again. And I'm really doing it through the third season of my podcast, which is unfolding as this audio memoir, and then like some extra interviews about storytelling and identity as well. And so it feels like I've always felt like I'm connecting the dots the whole time, and like I'm living my purpose and doing like what I am meant to do. But this just feels like an added layer of alignment, which I'm really looking forward to like putting out into the world and exploring further.
I love that. So give people a sense of how they can work with you and where they can find you.
Sure. So I work with folks one-on-one and virtually, which was a blessing that came out of the pandemic. And I actually really love working this way and know that it's a really great way for the people that I work with to work as well. And so you can find information about the Crafting Your Narrative programs that I offer through my company on the Tell Me a Story's website, which is tellmeastory.info. I've officially left social media, so you won't be able to find me there. But you can also listen to my podcast. It's called Rashomon, and you can type it into whatever app you listen to podcasts, wherever you're listening to this, you can listen to that as well.
Oh, I love that. And for anybody listening who's feeling a little excited, a little inspired, stirred around your own storytelling, I I just can't say enough good things about this woman and her ability to extract your stories and help you build confidence to tell your stories. So you've got to look at her work. She's amazing. Thank you so much for being here. I could go all day talking with you. This is so fun.
I could go all day talking with you. Thank you so much,
maybe
Carla.
maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Differently. I hope it stirred your thinking, and I invite you to take one inspired action from something that stood out to you. If you want to hear more conversations like this, hit subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with people you know. Remember, new episodes drop weekly. See you next week.